Welcome everybody to another episode of Campfire Conversations. I am here in Harrisville, New Hampshire in the United States, and it's my great privilege to be here today with the inspirational, the wonderful David Sobel, and we're going to have a conversation today about some of David's work and the inspiration that he's provided us at Educator by Nature, and the inspiration that we take for all of the programs that we do and the work that we do in Australia. And thank you so much for this time, David.
You betcha. It's really fun hanging out.
We've spent the morning so far, or the afternoon just now, stacking a wood pile, getting our hands working and dirty.
Right. An important part of the voluntary simplicity lifestyle.
I love that.
Yeah.
I'd love to have a conversation with you, David, to go through. So your work in the 7 design principles is revolutionary in the work that we do.
Right.
And just recently I was talking to a colleague, Cameron Sprague from Stramash, and you were speaking to him about the fact that the 7 is not an exhaustive list.
Right. Not at all.
And I'd love to unpack that with you,
Right.
if we may.
Yeah. Though it's interesting I was thinking about where I just read something that I wrote where I articulated where the whole idea of design principles came from. And it happened when I was doing research with kids in the late 1980s. And I thought I was going to write a book on map making. I did eventually write a book on map making, but at that point I hadn't written any books. And I was having kids draw me neighborhood maps and then take me on field trips to show me the places that were important to them. And I did it in Devon, in England, for 3 or 4 months. And I was really fascinated by the fact that kids really wanted to show me their dens, their secret places. Right?
Yep.
And then we relocated to a little, very isolated island in the Caribbean, an island called Carriacou that was part of Grenada, really not touristy cultured at all, and actually felt like a kind of very Afro-Caribbean culture from long ago, and collected maps from kids, and the kids started showing me their dens and forts and special places, and it was 2 such completely different places, in the environment and the ecology and the all white kids in England, all black kids in the Caribbean. Couldn't have been more culturally and environmentally different, but the kids were doing the same things. And so I realized, there's some biological inclination here that's old, that expresses itself through kids. And then so the whole idea of forts or special places was the first notion of a design principle. And then I started looking for other ones after that. And then so I've kind of gradually accreted these other kind of design principles. And it's hard to, I can't be as articulate about when the other ones showed up.
Okay.
Right.
That's a pretty specific detail about when the first one showed
No,
up.
actually, one of them showed up when I took a course by a guy who was the founder of the environmental studies program at Antioch, and he taught a marine ecology course on the coast of Maine, and he taught it by having all the students. I was a student this one year, and he taught it by having us map 2 different tide pools. And we mapped a tide pool in the lower intertidal zone and then in the upper intertidal zone, and then looked at the differences between them, and that became the basis for understanding marine ecology, ecological principles. And it was understanding ocean ecology or marine ecology through a close focus on a tide pool might be this big. And that was that's where I understood the small world principle. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, it's great to hear the insight into where those came from.
Right.
But then what else then? So I know you were speaking about fire, and we were speaking about fire last night.
Yeah, fire I left out.
Yeah. On purpose?
No.
Okay.
No, if I was going to add design principles, playing with or interacting with fire would definitely be one of them. And then another one would be playing with water,
Yep.
the water play thing. And so I always feel a little bit, I feel less like, I left out the water thing, because
Okay.
that seems widely dispersed. The playing with fire thing seems less inherently in all kids. So I tend to think of all those design principles as really manifesting in most kids,
Yep.
right? The water thing is manifest in all
All children.
children, and that. So I kind of backfill it by saying, well, when I talk about like I always think about damming streams and making villages and flooding the villages, and that whole process, that being a kind of inherently fascinating process. And so I say that's kind of a small worlds thing. But
With water involved.
yeah,
Yeah.
but playing with water. I mean, I always say that the most engaging exhibits in children's museums are the water play places.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, yes, there's all the loose parts stuff is pretty compelling, but the water play is really the most compelling.
And I think universally we see children at beaches or at edges of rivers and ponds and things, and definitely in our programs that water is a fascinating feature of their play, and it's one of the ultimate loose parts.
Right.
I think a beach full of sand and water, those two things combined,
Yeah.
you've got all of the ingredients for some wonderful play.
Yeah. Who was it said, if there is magic in the planet, it's contained in water?
Whoa,
Yeah.
I like that.
I can't remember who that was.
Oh, I'll be searching that one.
Right.
And I think that's beautiful as well, because they say if you, especially with children, but if you ever have a child who's dysregulated, either put water in them, on them, or around them. Like give them a drink of water, have them splash water on their face, or submerge them in water.
Right.
And that helps to regulate a lot. I'm not saying
Right.
put children in water, but
Right.
that go for a swim or...
Right.
And I think, when I arrived here, what's the one thing that we went to do? You went
Right.
for a swim.
Got to
in the
go
pond.
for a swim. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. I'm connecting now when we're saying water and fire and the other design principles. It makes me think of Ellen Sandsetter's work and the types of risky play.
Oh, right. Right.
Because there's dangerous elements in that, which I think would be fire and water.
Right.
I suppose. And I'm wondering whether you said before that you see water as more universally accessed by more children. I'm wondering whether fire is not, because of that risky element, and they don't actually have access to it as much. But if they did, would it be as prevalent?
Yeah, I wonder about that. I think there's some inherent fear of fire, and there isn't an inherent fear of water as much. I think, but you just don't. I don't see all kids attracted to fire the way I see all kids attracted to water.
Yeah.
I do know that with my son, you talked about lighting your lawn on fire, right?
Yep.
Yeah. I would come home from work and I would go into our barn, which had a poured concrete floor, and I would find little fire scars
Yep.
on the floor in the garage, and I would think, okay, this is not a good thing. And so when my son was about 7 years old, I built a fire circle for him in the backyard. And then I made him a fire kit. And I said, you can do fires anytime you want, as long as they're here
Yep. and
not anyplace else. And if you do it anyplace else, I'm taking everything gets taken away.
Yeah.
And that was one of the better parenting things that I did, and, he had flint and steel and bow drill and stuff like that, but he didn't ever really use them. He just used matches, but he would spend a lot of time by himself making fires. And I remember one time he went out after dark, it was in the fall, he went out after dark and built himself a fire. And it was the first time he had done that. And he came back in and he said, I thought I was going to be kind of scared and lonely out there, but I wasn't. And it was like the fire was my friend, and it was really wonderful. And so
I love that.
that's the same. So that is, that does get at that kind of fire as a design principle, or fire as a friend.
Yeah.
That will kind of keep you company when you're alone.
Yeah. And I suppose that's interesting in the way that we can look to the design principles as both understanding of the way that children play and observing and noticing their play, but also when we're designing experiences and spaces for children to be in.
Yeah.
So I think it's exciting to think of those extras as additional design principles to keep in mind.
And basically I'm not sure there's an infinite number of design principles, but there might be 50.
Yeah.
And the premise, when I would teach about them, I teach about the 7 design principles, and then on the final exam, they had to create a new one. Right?
Wow, I love that.
That was always, I said, because the idea here is just close observation of children and see what their recurrent fascinations are.
Yeah.
So look at your own childhood, or look at your own kids, or look at kids that you see playing, and look at what the fascination is, and then try and figure out how to extract it and use it. I remember that I was always, when I was a preschool teacher, we used to have a really good block collection. Block collections have kind of disappeared. But we had those really good solid maple blocks, and we had a fantastic collection of them. And we had gerbils. And I was always fascinated by the recurrent interest in making mazes for the gerbils.
Oh, wow.
Making mazes and houses for the gerbils. So it was some some combination of animal allies and small worlds.
Yep.
But there was something. Yeah, making worlds for animals is almost a subspecies of design principles.
Yeah.
And invariably, there would be a large block construction built for the gerbil, which would collapse, and gerbils would die.
Oh, yep.
And it was recurrent enough that I knew it was going to happen, and I didn't try, and I put a lot of emphasis on, you got to be really careful with the blocks, but I knew it was going to happen, and then when it happened, then we used it as an opportunity to talk about death and to celebrate the life of the gerbil and things like that. And so it wasn't itself. It wasn't quite a design principle, but it was something that I knew was going to happen, and it was something that I knew had a lot of inherent learning potential in it to take advantage of it. And I was considered gerbils expendable for the purposes of education. I got into trouble a lot with that idea.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really important point. And I wonder if that's a subset of the animal allies, because obviously through that design principle, there's development of empathy and care and connection with other than human beings.
Right.
But we have this conversation a lot. A lot of our programs at Educator by Nature happen on the edge of the river, and there are jellyfish. There's jellyfish that we can handle. Their stingers don't penetrate the human skin. But ultimately, through picking up, handling jellyfish, putting them in buckets, making aquariums for them, some of those jellyfish end up with a thumb through them, or squished in two, or left in the sun a little bit too long and they start to evaporate, and things like that. And that element of sacrificial nature in order to develop deeper connection to is something that we get challenged on a lot.
Really?
In the work that we do. And even things like, working with ants or bugs or small things that are inevitably, through the sheer force of children's play, might get squished.
Yep.
we don't encourage it, but it's
Right.
something that happens. So I think you're right in saying that
Yeah.
that's something to keep in mind when you're designing that opportunity, that experience, that affordance for children's play. That death is an important thing that we talk about.
Right. And you're right, yeah. And you kind of know it's going to happen, and you prepare, and you have a good plan for
Yeah.
what you do when it happens.
Yeah.
Because the whole notion of, kind of making death present in kids' lives is an important part of being alive.
Yeah.
Right.
That cycle of life.
Yeah. Yeah. It just made me think of something. Nope, lost it.
We have a parenting guru, Maggie Dent,
Oh,
in
right.
Australia, who a lot of her advice for parents is that if you have children, you should have a pet, and that pet should ultimately be a pet. Like a dog is great, but a dog lasts too long. That you should have a pet that is going like a
really?
hamster or a hermit, or not a hermit, a hamster or a
Hermit crab.
hermit crab.
Yeah.
Something like that has a short lifespan,
Right.
so that it will die in the child's life
Right.
as a child, and then you have an opportunity to discuss and talk and unpack what
Right.
death and end of life, and
Exactly.
yeah, I think those things are really important.
In the work that Jen, my wife, did, with sixth graders, she always there's lots of examples of, spontaneously created burial rituals for
Yep.
dead animals.
Uh-huh.
That kids, whether you, with older kids, they'll do it themselves.
Yeah.
But whether you create them or not, kids will incline towards wanting to ritualize the death, the memorialization of the dead animal.
Yep.
And that's part of that's what we should be planning for, is
Yeah.
that kind of memorialization process.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. All right, a bit of a change of tact from death. You were talking. You were talking this morning. So I had the chance to visit the school that David started, the Harrisville Children's Centre.
Yep.
And what a wonderful place that is. But you were saying that you were hoping to institutionalize whimsy.
Right.
Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah. Yeah, it's always been, that's an inherently contradictory term, because whimsy is not
Institutional.
institutionalizable, right? That was what I liked about it, is that there's a dynamic tension to the idea of institutionalizing whimsy. So how do you create structures that facilitate the potential emergence of whimsy, and then celebrating it when it occurs? And so, the curriculum, or what the program was all about, you never wanted it to be too rigid that it wasn't open to the bird in the window. David Hawkins used to always talk about the bird in the window. So you could take advantage of, like, when the bird showed up in the window, and drop things and focus on the bird. One of the great examples of institutionalizing whimsy happened at the school after I wasn't a teacher or director there anymore. But there was a guy who was kind of volunteering with the school, and at that point, the Harrisville Children's Center, went up through third grade. So it was an older third grade child who was fascinated with the Loch Ness Monster. And so Dick Neville, who was working with this child and a couple of other children, worked with this one girl and had her do research on the Loch Ness Monster, and they made a little film about the Loch Ness Monster. And then it was his whimsical idea to have the kids create. It went from being a little project for a small group of kids to being a big project for the school, to create a half-size model of the Loch Ness Monster. And so the Loch Ness Monster is, the estimates of it, it's about 50 or 60 feet long. So they created a model that was about 25 or 30 feet long.
Yeah.
And so it was created of a kind of a wood frame with chicken wire and then black plastic wrapped over the outside of it. And it, and so they created it at the school, kids and adults working together. And then one night, Dick and a bunch of other adults had the Loch Ness Monster located in the mill pond in the center of Harrisville.
Wow.
So nobody knew that it was being made at the school. Then it just shows up in the mill pond in the center of Harrisville. And Dick wrote a news release saying, Loch Ness Monster relocates to Harrisville because of being, hassled extensively in Scotland. So it decided to relocate to Harrisville. And the news story got picked up by the Associated Press. And then this news story showed up in newspapers all across the country, in Jacksonville and Phoenix and Seattle. And then people from around the country sent the news story back to the school. This all happened kind of spontaneously.
Yeah.
And then the teacher at the school created a geography unit with the second and third, the older kids, based on having a map of the United States, learning the geography of the United States based on where the Loch Ness Monster stories came from.
Yeah.
And so that was one of those pure examples of what I refer to as authentic curriculum.
You can't plan that.
Yeah. Right. But you can be available to it.
Yeah.
Right. And that was the whole institutionalizing thing. Is it like, okay, this is good enough so that we should not do what we were planning on doing. We're not going to do the math book pages 43 for 48. We're going to stop it. We're going to take advantage of this kind of thing.
I'm so passionate about that being something that our education system has in it today.
Right.
And my heart hurts because I feel like there's a lot of teachers out there who, because they're working in schools where they are given programs and they need to follow a program from page, as you said, like page 1 through page 55 in this order, and then take out the next book. I think there can be a sense of losing trust in our ability to follow that whimsy.
Right.
So we need more of those stories to inspire us to continue to operate in these ways.
In that book that I did recently called The Sky Above and the Mud Below, which is about a collection of stories of early childhood educators and doing nature work around the country, there's this great story by a woman named Megan Gessler, who was working in Chicago area, and with a group of kids on a walk one day, they discovered a geocache. And the geocache was of like an old ammunition box, and inside of it were a bunch of those gold foil covered coins, right? Chocolate coins. So the 4 and 5-year-old kids, on finding this, said, "This is pirate treasure."
Of course.
Oh, there must be pirates around here.
Yep.
And they said, and there must be more pirate treasure, and and there's going to be more pirate treasure on the other side of this stream. And so the kids wanted to cross the stream to get to where there's going to be more pirate treasure. So instead of saying, well, no, the stream's too deep, it's the middle of winter, we're going to get too cold, she says, oh, well, how could we get across the stream? And they said, well, we could make a boat. And instead of saying, well, no, we can't really make a boat, she said, let's figure out how to make a boat. And so so she went with this whole pirate fantasy. This is a good example of the fantasy design principle. She went with this whole pirate fantasy, and they spent a couple of days of brainstorming how to make how to make a raft and how to put it together, and stuff didn't. They tried to get a whole bunch of sticks and glue it together. A lot of glue, a lot of very messy glue. And,
sounds great.
And it didn't work. Yeah. And so they eventually figured out how to make a raft, and then they dragged it was a long way from where they were, their little indoor space, back to this stream.
Yeah.
Like about 3/4 of a mile. They figured out how to get the raft on a wagon and balance it and get it down to the stream. And they found a place where the stream was narrow enough that where the raft actually became a bridge.
Fantastic.
And they made it over to the other side. And they were kind of overjoyed. So where were we? So
Bridge.
the fact that she had gone with the fantasy and let the kids figure out how to make a bridge, I think it's the perfect example of what STEM learning ought to look like.
Uh-huh.
So so the kids were thrilled that they had solved this problem and they got to the other side of the stream, and then she realized, oh no. She says, we're going to get to the other side of the stream.
And there's not going to be
There's not going to be any more pirate treasure.
Yeah.
And so they didn't go very far, and there was a stream channel that had been filled with water, and the water had frozen, and then the water level had dropped. Mm-hmm. And so then the ice just kind of collapses and breaks into shards, big kind of chunks of icy diamonds. And the kids saw it and they said, there's the pirate treasure. It was these big icy diamonds. And then it went on. Then they brought a bunch of those big shards back to the classroom, and they did ice investigations. And it was the perfect example of following the whimsy and having it just be a fantastic emergent curriculum.
Yeah. And like you go through a list of all of the curriculum outcomes that experience would have covered. Mm-hmm. And that could be your entire curriculum.
Right.
We just need that opportunity to be flexible, have time, and go with the flow.
Right.
That's inspirational. So I think to wrap up, what I would love to chat to you about is, so you one of your famous quotes that inspires a lot of the work that we do is, for children need to love the earth before we ask them to save it. Mm-hmm. What are your top tips for supporting children to truly fall in love with the earth? What do we need to be doing to make that a reality?
Yeah. Well, you need a well scaffolded nature immersion program, mm-hmm. so that kids feel safe and that you gradually introduce them to places and then allow them to explore it. And you need to restrain yourself from talking to kids about environmental tragedy. And that's hard to do. I've had a couple of conversations, I think it was a year or two ago, with a woman who runs a nature program I think it's in Boise, Idaho. Mm-hmm. And she had teachers who really wanted to teach sustainability, mm-hmm. and who wanted to teach climate change, mm-hmm. with the preschoolers. And then she had a bunch of parents who said, "No, wait a second, we want our kids in this because we want them playing outdoors, right?" Yeah. And so it was a perfect illustration of the dilemma of biting your tongue, yep. and not feeling like you have to immerse kids in environmental issues when they're really young. Yeah. And what you want to do is that, like the pirate treasure example, is you want to give them experiences of them solving a real problem. Mm-hmm. That was, figuring out how to get to the other side of that stream was a real problem. Mm-hmm. And so they learned that, hey, we can figure this. We did this, mm-hmm. right? So that's what we need, is the "we did this" feeling in young kids, and we need the "we did this" experience in progressively greater increments as kids move up through their schooling. Yeah. So that by the time they're in middle school or high school, they can start dealing with big issues. Yeah. And so there's a lot of interesting writing by Louise Chowell. Are you familiar with Louise Chowell at all?
No.
And she's done a lot of interesting recent writing where she both looks at the research on how you facilitate kids' relationship to the natural world and their eventual conservation behavior,
Okay.
and the research on what preserves hope in children. And so you have to be working towards this synthesis of nature connection and hope as your aspiration for what you're doing with kids. And too much early tragedy just squelches hope.
Oh, I'm definitely going to research her work.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking back to the treasure on the other side of the creek.
Right.
I wonder, because if they had have, in that moment, walked to find a way over, I don't think those shards of ice would have been the treasure.
As treasurable, right? Or yeah.
It's that the adversity that they go through,
Right.
the process, they were fully invested in that.
Right.
That process. I think they were going to find treasure no matter what was over the other side.
Right.
And that comes back. That's hope.
Yeah.
They built that hope into that experience.
Right. Exactly.
I want to bring one more conversation up. We were talking last night about the research that you were talking about some nature, lots of nature, or no nature.
Right.
I'd love to have a conversation about that.
Yeah. It's hard to do that.
It is.
It's hard to synopsize that, but we can try.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I might be able to link the paper.
Right.
link the research.
So we've done it, kind of been involved with a lot of other colleagues on research on comparing nature-based early childhood programs to traditional early childhood programs. And traditional high-quality early childhood programs.
Yep.
So you want to make sure that you're comparing really kind of child-centered, thoughtful teaching kinds of comparisons, so that you're not comparing good early childhood education with bad early childhood education. You're comparing good nature-based early childhood education with good traditional early childhood education. And when you look at kind of standard metrics of academic achievement, there's basically not much difference between the two. Is that kids in nature-based programs essentially develop literacy and numeracy skills at the same rates as kids in traditional programs, even though the kids in the nature-based programs are doing much less direct instruction. But then when you look at other measures that are more social emotional measures, like the whole concept of resilience, or there's a lot of interest in executive function, and generally European programs, early childhood programs, are much more interested in the social emotional growth in kids. So they're much more interested in developing kids' resilience and executive function than in early literacy and numeracy. So in the last couple of years, the colleague of mine at the University of Minnesota Duluth, a woman named Julie Ernst, we used a metric that looked at the development of resilience in nature-based programs versus traditional early childhood programs in one school district, and then in another school district we looked at executive function in nature-based programs versus traditional programs. And in both of those studies, it turned out that there were three different kinds of groups of teachers and kids. There was groups of kids where the teacher did not do much nature. There was a group of kids where the teacher did some nature, not a lot, not all the time, but some. And then there were the teachers that did a lot of nature. And then we looked at the impact on measures of resilience and measures of executive function. And the surprising finding was that the kids in the some nature group were significantly different than the kids in the not much nature group in terms of developing resilience and executive function. There was a statistically significant difference. However, there wasn't much difference between the kids in the some nature group and the a lot of nature group. Both of them, they both together had developed more resilience and executive function than the traditional groups, but there wasn't much difference between some and a lot. And so therefore, what we've extracted from this is that the whole notion of incorporating nature into your teaching practice, you don't have to go whole hog. You don't have to do the all day, every day outside, lots of the time. If you incorporate an hour or two a day in your 6-hour day, that's going to have a significant impact potentially on kids' social emotional growth, which is and that's a really good thing.
That's incredible. I will definitely, find that research and
and
link it to this video.
I sent those both to you this morning,
Wonderful.
all that stuff to you this morning.
Wonderful. I'll add that. Well, I think a challenge to all of our viewers is to think about your own observations of children or your own experiences yourself and come up with what your other than 7 design principles might be. Come up with one and send it in to us. But David, thank you so much for having me here in Harrisville, for your time today chatting with us, and for the inspirational work that you do. Thank you so much.
It's great hanging out.
Till next time, see you later.